I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the beer. Or maybe deep down I just wanted to prove that St. Vincent's Cemetery was nothing but stone and dirt, that the stories weren't real. "You won't do it," Mark had said, leaning back against my car with a smug grin. "Nobody goes in there at night." "You scared?" I shot back. He chuckled. "I'm not the one who has to go in." And that was that. $50 on the table. Walk through St. Vincent's alone, midnight sharp, and come back in one piece. I thought it would be easy. I was wrong. The cemetery was older than the town itself, a relic from the 1800s. The iron gate groaned as I pushed it open, rust flaking off beneath my fingers. My flashlight cut through the darkness in weak, flickering beams, barely illuminating the winding path of graves. I kept my eyes on the ground, stepping carefully over roots and crumbling headstones. The air was thick, damp with the scent of moss and earth. The wind stirred the trees, whispering through the leaves like hushed voices. And then I heard it. Soft, shaky. A woman crying. I stopped cold. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable over the rustling branches. But it was there, deep, sorrowful weeping. I told myself it was the wind, but my feet had already started moving toward it. She sat on a grave near the center of the cemetery, hunched forward, shrouded in heavy black fabric. The veil covered her face, blending into the darkness. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her thin shoulders trembling as she wept. Something about her made my stomach twist. She was so still, too still. I cleared my throat. Ma'am? Are you okay?" The weeping stopped. Silence pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Then, slowly, she turned her head. The veil shifted just enough for me to see the edge of her face. My breath caught in my throat. Her skin was gray, stretched thin over sharp bones. Her lips, what was left of them, had been stitched shut with thick, black thread. The thread pulled at her decayed flesh, warping her mouth into a grotesque, unnatural grimace. I staggered back. And then she whispered my name. It wasn't her voice. It was something else, something that slithered through the air, dry and hollow, like wind through dead leaves. "You came back." The words pressed against my skull, filling my head with something wrong. My lungs seized as I gasped for air. The ground beneath me blurred, twisting into something unfamiliar. My pulse pounded in my ears. Memories, ones that didn't belong to me, flashed behind my eyes. I saw myself kneeling in this very spot, holding her hand. Her fingers were thin, cold, curled around mine in a desperate grip. "You'll come back for me, won't you?" she had whispered. And I, whoever I had been back then, had promised. A sharp, piercing pain lanced through my head, and I stumbled back against a headstone. The cemetery around me shifted, warping like a mirage. But she was closer now. She was floating, her feet inches above the ground, moving toward me in unnatural silence. The veil fluttered, revealing more of her ruined face, her stitched mouth curling, as if she were trying to speak. "Stop," I choked out. My voice was barely above a whisper. Her hand rose. Fingers, long and withered, reached toward my face. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but my body felt heavy, as if something was wrapping around my limbs, keeping me still. "You promised." The whisper came from behind me this time. I turned nothing. But when I faced forward again, she was gone. The air around me collapsed, the cemetery shifting, distorting. The graves stretched taller, the trees bending in unnatural angles. The tombstones pulsed, shifting like open mouths. Then I felt it. cold fingers wrapping around my wrist. A voice, her voice, inside my head. You promised. Something yanked me downward. The earth opened beneath me, dragging me into the grave. I screamed. And then I was outside the gates. The cemetery was quiet. The sky had lightened to a dull gray, signaling dawn. I was lying in the dirt road, my clothes torn, my skin ice cold. Mark found me half an hour later, shaking. "Dude, what the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice tense. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. But when he picked up my phone, where I had been recording the whole thing, his face went pale. The last few seconds of the video showed nothing but darkness. And then, scrawled into the dirt, barely visible in the faint glow of the camera light, was a message. You promised. I don't know what I promised. I don't know who she was. But I know she's still waiting for me. I never wanted to work at Hollow Hills Cemetery. But life doesn't always give you choices. I was broke, barely scraping by, and when the groundskeeper job opened up, I took it. It was supposed to be easy, mowing the grass, fixing broken headstones, and occasionally digging a grave. Simple. Until the night I dug up the wrong one. It started with a mistake in the records. Mr. Callahan, my boss, handed me a list of upcoming burials, along with a map of the cemetery. The grave I needed to prepare was in Section D, Row 5. But when I got there, the ground was already disturbed, the dirt loose and uneven. Someone must have prepped it already, I muttered. But I had a job to do. I started digging. The first few feet were normal, damp soil, the occasional root. But then my shovel hit something hard. I expected wood. What I found was metal. I knelt, brushing away the dirt. The object beneath me wasn't an ordinary coffin. It was steel, thick and bolted shut. No name, no dates, just a single phrase carved into the surface. Do not open. My pulse quickened. I told myself to leave it alone. Maybe it was a time capsule or some weird burial tradition. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. And I was stupid enough to ignore the warning. I grabbed my crowbar and worked at the bolts. It took longer than I expected. The metal was thick, the lid sealed tight. But eventually, with one final groan of protest, it popped open. The air shifted. A wave of rot spilled out, thick and suffocating. But beneath it, there was something else. Something alive. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my grip. And then I saw him. A man lay inside the coffin. But he wasn't decayed. His skin was smooth, his black suit perfectly pressed. He looked as if he had been buried just minutes ago. Except for his eyes. They were open. Pitch black, glossy, like two polished stones. A whisper slithered through the air. You shouldn't have done that. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from me. It wasn't coming from anywhere. Then he sat up. The motion was too smooth, too unnatural, like a puppet being lifted by invisible strings. His head tilted slightly, his lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. I stumbled backward. My foot caught on a loose stone, and I crashed onto my back. The ground beneath me shifted. The cemetery changed. Gravestones twisted, stretching taller, their names warping into symbols I couldn't understand. The earth trembled, the sky darkened. The air smelled wrong, like burning flesh and damp wood. I tried to stand, but something was holding me down. Hands, rotting hands, burst from the soil, fingers clawing at my ankles, my wrists, my throat. I screamed. The man in the coffin just watched, his head tilting, his black eyes gleaming. You have two choices, he murmured. His voice was soft, almost gentle. Put me back. The hands tightened around me. Or take my place. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I did. I clawed my way free, lunging toward the coffin lid. My fingers fumbled with the bolts, my vision blurring. The earth beneath me crumbled, dragging at my legs. I shoved the lid closed. The moment it sealed shut, the world snapped back. The ground was still. The graves were normal. The sky was clear. I was lying next to a freshly dug hole, my clothes soaked in sweat. The coffin was gone. I never saw it again. The next morning, Mr. Callahan found me sitting outside the gates, staring at the cemetery. I quit that day. I don't know who or what was in that coffin. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up gasping for air, feeling the weight of unseen hands pressing against my skin. And I hear his voice. Soft. Patient. You should have taken my place. It was a little past midnight when I saw her. A lone girl, standing at the entrance of Hollow Oak Cemetery, barefoot and dressed in a thin, white nightgown. The night was cold, too cold for a child to be outside alone. At first, I thought she was lost. I slowed my car, my headlights washing over her small frame. She didn't react. She just stood there, staring at the cemetery gates, her hands hanging limply at her sides. Something about her made my skin crawl. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored her. But instead I rolled down my window. "Hey, sweetheart," I called. "Are you okay?" She turned her head toward me, slowly, like she wasn't used to moving. That's when I saw her eyes. Pale, almost white, like the fog that curled around her ankles. "Help me find my mommy," she whispered. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't just abandon her. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" I asked carefully. She lifted a small hand and pointed. "Into the cemetery." I pulled over, killed the engine, and grabbed my phone. The fog was thick, swirling around my feet as I stepped out. The cemetery beyond the gates stretched into the darkness, rows of tombstones barely visible beneath the shroud of mist. The girl stood motionless, watching me. I hesitated. "Are you lost?" I asked again. She didn't answer. She just turned and began walking. Into the cemetery. I hesitated for only a second before following. The moment I stepped through the gate, the air grew wrong, thicker, heavier. My footsteps were muffled by the fog, and the silence pressed against my ears like a vice. The girl walked ahead, small and pale, her nightgown fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. Something about the way she moved made me uneasy, like she wasn't walking but gliding. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, but she hummed, a quiet, lilting tune that sent ice crawling down my spine. A lullaby. It sounded wrong. I swallowed hard, gripping my phone tighter. My flashlight barely cut through the fog, but I kept moving, stepping carefully over roots and broken stones. Then I saw her. A woman stood between the graves, her back turned to us. Her hair was long and brittle, her dress old and tattered. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The little girl stopped. "There she is," she whispered. A chill crawled up my spine. Something was wrong with this. I took a cautious step forward. "Ma'am?" No response. The fog thickened around her, coiling like fingers. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, a suffocating heaviness curling around my ribs. Then she turned, and my stomach dropped. Her face was a skull. Skin stretched thin over bone, hollow sockets where eyes should be, lips pulled into a grin too wide, too unnatural. I staggered back, heart hammering in my chest. The girl beside me laughed. I turned to her, my breath hitching. She wasn't a child anymore. Her mouth stretched into a grin far too wide, her white eyes glistening. Her feet weren't touching the ground. "My mommy says thank you," she whispered. Cold hands brushed against my shoulders. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember how I found my car. But when I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the ignition, the headlights cut through the fog. And they were both standing there, watching me, smiling. I peeled out of there so fast my tires screamed against the pavement. I never drove that road again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft knock at my window, and a child's voice whispering, "Help me find my mommy,"